This is the Spirit and Wellness Show. News and information from a higher perspective. With your host, Harry Wilkinson.
Yes, hello, this is your host, Harry Wilkinson, and welcome to the Spirit and Wellness Show. This is the show where we take a look at the days and weeks events, happenings in the world of politics, international news, the media, film, television, anything and everything that we hear about throughout our week, and we take a look at it from a higher perspective. And as I always explain at the top of the show, what I mean by a higher perspective is a spiritual point of view, a spiritual perspective, in which we understand that we are one. We have a connection, a connectedness in spirit that goes beyond our physical awareness, our everyday awareness, and that through this we create all of the things we interact with on this in our everyday life. And so by taking that step back and looking at these stories that we are creating, we reconnect with our higher selves, and we start to understand the truth of who and what we really are. So that's why they're very important. That's why it's very important to take a look at these stories that may be button pushing for a lot of us, may make us angry or fearful, or even give us a sense of what may be a sense of false hope in some senses, but maybe makes us feel happy for a while. And we take a look at all of these stories and understand that they all have meaning for us, that they're all part of our spiritual existence and all part of our spiritual joy, because they are illusions. In reality, we create them in a way that we create holograms or video games or movies to experience things almost in a vicarious way, and to experience the exhilaration, but with an understanding, somewhere in the background, that this isn't really who we are. We are playing a game, if you will. So that's the point of view that this comes from. And if you have not listened to the show before, you might not know that just recently I've made a decision that we're going to focus on what I call the transition era, and which I believe has already started, quite frankly, for the past 3 years or so, since 2012. On this show, I've talked about the period of time, which I think in history, when we look back at it, will most certainly be considered a time of social change and upheaval. And I explained through my astrological point of view, as many astrologers have spoken about the connection or the angle that Pluto and Uranus were connecting over that period of time, and this astrological aspect is what I think symbolizes what was going on during that time. Pluto is the planet of power, deep power, obsessive power. It's also thought to be connected to, death and destruction and rebirth. And Uranus is the planet of change and revolution and new ideas and to a large degree optimism. So when these two planets are at odds with each other, as they have been over the past 3 years, what you have is a period of long and deep change. And since these are two planets that are slow moving planets in our solar system, their effects, astrologically speaking, are longer term. Pluto's the slowest moving planet, even though they've downgraded it from planet status to, I don't know what they call it now, mini planet status. But astrologically speaking, it hasn't changed one bit. It's still the slowest moving planet. So anything involving that planet, and Uranus is also a slow moving planet. Number one involves things on a generational scale. At a worldwide scale. That's number one. And number two, we're talking about very long-term effects and changes that last for, decades, basically. I can't remember how long it takes Pluto, how many years, but to make a complete revolution. But I think it's something like 200 or more. So, and we only discovered Pluto in the 1930s, so it hasn't even made a full revolution around the solar system yet. So, the changes it brings are that kind of slow, but not to fear. I mean, this is the evolution of ourselves that we're talking about here. So, in any case, now that we've left that transit of planets, what I've noticed, during that period of time, many issues really came to the fore. And as I say, when we look back on this in history, we'll see that this was the period of time where the Arab Spring began, where you have, and we still have, the situation in Syria. This is the period of time when you have the Russian and Ukraine situation. In our country, we've become more aware of than ever before of the disparity in income and what that is doing to so many of us. Also, we've become more aware of the situation for minorities in cities and towns across the country, in which they are experiencing undue and severe, harsh treatment from those in authority, police officers and such. This has become something that's front and center now in our minds, and when that happens, that means things are going to change. As long, and with a transit like Uranus and Pluto had, it basically also means the sort of a one step forward, two steps back kind of thing. It's not an easy change, particularly with Pluto in the mix, because Pluto is the planet that will try to pull back from that. So all of these now that we've left that particular transit, I'm saying that we are in a transition era where we're seeing our economy transition to something different than we've ever seen. We're seeing everything around us, our technology, everything. So our show today focuses on climate in the transition era and what's happening. Global warming finally has become a centerpiece of, well, certainly the Obama administration, but it finally really has become something that is no longer being denied. I mean, some are still vociferously trying to deny it, but most Republicans are still trying to deny it. But it is something, actions are being taken about it now that weren't and couldn't have been taken up until now. So we're going to talk about how that's working and how, interestingly enough, our system is kind of turning itself on its own head to make some of these changes actually happen a little easier, I think. And we're also going to talk about a little bit of the history of yoga. And there's a wonderful article from the Washington Post about 5 myths about yoga that have been widely believed, and this sort of debunks some of that mythology. And we'll take a look at some of the, history and some of the founders of yoga and who brought it to our country and made it the form of exercise and spiritual practice that it now is. So, okay, first, let's talk about the global warming situation. So, pardon me. So, there's an article on the BBC News website about global warming's food shocks. And the information that's come across is that it looks like climate change is increasing the risk of severe food shocks. Food shocks are where crops fail and the prices of those crops rise rapidly around the world. So scientists and researchers are saying that climate change is increasing the risk of these food shocks, and that extreme weather events that impact food production could be happening in 7 years out of 10 by the end of this century. And the authors argue that an over-reliance on global trade, which we are focusing on quite a bit these days, may make these production shocks worse. And they're estimating that these impacts are going to be most likely felt across Africa and the Middle East. Poor harvests and low stocks of grain in 2008 combined with a host of other factors to produce a spectacular price rise in cereals, with a UN index price of prices peaking at 2.8 times higher than it was at the turn of the millennium in 2000. In 2010 and 2011, a heat wave in Russia led to the country's worst drought in 40 years, decimating the grain harvest and leading indirectly to food riots in North African countries as prices of bread rose rapidly. Food riots. So, it's happening right now. And this happened 5 years ago. Now, researchers from the US and the UK have analyzed the chances of extreme weather events causing these types of food shocks as the world warms over the coming century. Looking at the production of rice, wheat, maize, and soybeans, the scientists found that the chances of a 1 in 100 year production disruption is likely to increase to a 1 in 30 year event by 2040. 2040. Yeah. So, 25 years from now. Then they say from 2070 onward, they estimate that severe shocks, which could see global production drop by 10%, could be happening in 7 out of 10 years. 10% production drop. That might not sound like a lot, but what that means is that you're going to have a scarcity of food that you haven't seen before, worldwide. Talk about food riots in northern African countries. You're going to have food riots everywhere, in the world. Even here, possibly. So one of these authors, her name is Kirsty Lewis, she says it is very difficult to characterize these extreme events and their frequency, but what we do see clearly is that events that are very rare in the present day are becoming more frequent in the future. The most extreme events of the future are likely to become more intense, so potentially larger shocks and more frequent shocks. Frequent and larger. What a combo. So, UN's Food and Agricultural Organization says that increasing population will drive demand for food up by 60%. 60% by 2050. That's over more than half. And this population increase will be, by the way, the places where the population is increasing the most are places in the Middle East and Africa, and less so here in the United States and in Western Europe. In fact, populations will either be stabilizing or decreasing in the coming years because well, there are a number of factors, but among them are, families that are having less children, waiting longer to have children, and so forth. So, climate change could be the extra element that rapidly changes the global picture. We've got these pressures on the food system, part of which is climate change, says Professor Tim Benton. But we're highlighting the fact that with weather variability and increases of extremes, we're adding another layer of difficulty because it happens suddenly within a year. It is more difficult to adjust slowly, like we'd cope with demand increases. If we're coping with demand increase by sustainable intensification, but then we suddenly have a catastrophic year and we lose a big chunk of the world's calories, everybody will feel it. The biggest impact these production shocks of the shocks were likely to be felt across Africa and the Middle East, said the authors. And as I said, that's where the population is going to be rising the most. Countries like the UK and the US would be more able to cope because more processed food is consumed in the wealthier regions, so the changing price of basic commodities will be less of a factor in the price. The most vulnerable countries, of course, are the ones that are going to be worse affected. They're going to be low-income food deficit countries, predominantly those in sub-Saharan Africa. Said author Rob Bailey from Chatham House. Sorry, it's just the impact of this is hitting me pretty hard. You can imagine that the poorest households in these sorts of countries spending upwards of 50% of their income on food. So if you're in a situation where food prices are increased by 50 to 100%, that leaves them in an almost untenable position. Researchers say that international trade worked well when food was in plentiful supply, but when demand increased, countries often imposed export controls, which usually made the situation worse. And then another factor was biofuel, where land was taken out of food production, tipping the balance towards scarcity. The researchers say that governments must try to understand the risks rather than simply stockpiling food and grain. There should be efforts to reform world trade so that countries don't retreat behind barriers when crops fail. Significant research on agriculture must be carried out to ensure it can cope with increased demand and increasing temperatures. Developed countries may be able to ride out the worst effects of food shocks, warned Professor Benton, but there might well be other significant impacts. In a sense, what we're living with ISIS today came out of a spark that came from food price rises. Okay, that sentence wasn't quite written correctly. I think what they are saying here is, in a sense, what we're living with ISIS today came out of a spark that came from food price rises. In other words, there were, perhaps food riots or desperation, a sense of desperation that ISIS has been able to use and exploit. There's the drama, if you will. There's the element of tension, the element of of fear. Now here comes the other side of the story. Here comes the good news. Here comes the rescuers. So carbon, as you probably know, is the biggest problem for climate change. The excess of carbon in the atmosphere is what is making the planet warmer. So, guess what? There are a number of startup companies that are building industrial-scale carbon dioxide scrubbers to remove millions of tons of the greenhouse gas from the atmosphere to help offset climate change. Because it's up there already, and the planet's already warming. So efforts to just stop, or put less carbon dioxide in the air are important, but they're not going to have any effect for years to come because we've already put it up there. But these companies are finding a way to take it out. Now, they're still, in many cases, looking for financial backing to get their dreams off the ground. Some of these businesses are called, there's one called in Calgary called Carbon Engineering. There's one in New York called Global Thermostat, and one in Switzerland called Climeworks. They've developed the technology so they can do it, but they need large-scale funding in order to really launch what they're doing. So this Carbon Engineering in Calgary is being backed by Bill Gates. So that's a good thing. And Global Thermostat has gained research funding from Exxon and Bell Labs. That's terrific. Having oil companies step up to the plate is really important. But they apparently need billions more of dollars in funding in order for it to be effective. So part of the problem apparently is that once they take the CO2 out of the atmosphere, there isn't a commercial demand for it, so they don't know what to do with it, and disposing of it would be a problem. So, technology to the rescue again. Climeworks seems to have found a solution to this by supplying their CO2 to a German-based firm called Sunfire. And they have a technology, Sunfire does, that takes this gas and converts it into a zero-carbon diesel fuel. Zero-carbon diesel fuel. In other words, it's a fuel that trucks could run on that has no carbon. All three companies are looking forward to supplying a future industry based on recycled fuel. Carbon Engineering's business development manager asks, how do you power global transportation in 20 years in a way that is carbon neutral? Cheap solar and wind are great at reducing emissions from the electricity. Then you are left with the transport sector. So, more attention is needed in this field, but the technology is there. And this will happen. This will happen. How long it will take, we don't know. So there's that. And that comes from an article on unknowncountry.com. Now, comes an article by a blogger named Tom Engelhardt at Tom Dispatch. And this article is about gas prices, the glut of oil on the market, and how that is changing some of the worst planet-destroying ideas that we've been kicking around, such as the I forget the name of it, but it's the tunnel, the pipeline. The Keystone XL pipeline, which you know, many have said is going to have devastating environmental effects, and so much so that the Obama administration has remained neutral on it and has not made a decision on whether to let it go forward or not. Meantime, we've got test drilling that's been green lighted in the Arctic and the South Atlantic, fracking in the American West here. So we've got that going on, but here's the interesting thing. If you remember, a few months ago, gas prices went down amazingly. Crude oil went down to, $46 a barrel, and this caused, a huge change, almost a near collapse in the oil industry. And in May, it started to go up again, and then people thought, well, that's over with now. Demand's going to increase, and so forth and so on. But as it turns out, in August, the oil prices began to fall again, down to $49, and in the U.S., all the way down to $45. And this is, of course, going to play havoc with the profits of oil companies, but it also is going to stop them from investing in some of these planet-destroying projects. So, unfortunately, the downside of it, of course, is that, with these, falling oil prices and the lack of demand for them, some folks are losing their jobs and so forth and so on. But the long-term consequences of this are going to prove significant. So in this article, this gentleman by the name of Michael Clare, writing on Tom Dispatch, he says, to conserve funds and ensure continuing profitability, major companies are canceling or postponing investments in new production ventures, especially complex, costly projects like the exploitation of Canadian tar sands and deep offshore fields that only turn a profit when oil is selling at $80 to $100 or more per barrel. And according to oil industry experts, top firms have already shelved $200 billion worth of spending on new projects, and 46 major oil and natural gas ventures containing an estimated 20 billion barrels of oil or its equivalent. So, okay, and I'm going to post some of these articles online for you as well. We'll get back to that in the next, probably the next episode of our show here. And because I really want to get more into the description of that. But we're running low on time here. But basically, this transition era that we are in, we are seeing the beginnings of this, the transition of oil and how it's used and produced, and and how we deal with this climate change. Innovations from technology and so forth and so on. So it's quite an exciting time to be around, I think. And I hope you will stick around for more on our show. Let me briefly get in a little bit of this yoga, and then I will we'll go into it more next week. But 5 myths about yoga, because yoga is been doubling in the amount of people who use it. between 2002 and 2012. And it's becoming, it's continued to become popular over the years. And of course, you've heard me on this program talk about it. I swear by it. But it's interesting they have these 5 myths now, and this is in the Washington Post, so this is a mainstream magazine that we're talking about here. So we'll talk about this more next week. We'll talk about the origins of yoga. There's some myths about that. People believe it's exclusively Hindu, and it's not. The religiosity of yoga, the people who were involved in the creation and promotion of what we know of yoga today, and so forth and so on. So I hope you tune in next week to hear some of that. And until then, may I wish you a joyful, prosperous, and enlightened week. See you next time.